Hi everyone, my name is Esethu Cenga and I am the co-founder and CEO of Rewoven, a textile recycling startup based in Cape Town, South Africa. So today I want to speak to you about the future of fashion and also how we can think about some climate smart solutions to fighting the problem of fast fashion and how fast fashion can ultimately contribute to climate change less. But before I get into that, I know some of you in the room are thinking right now, I'm not even a fashion person. I don't really care about this problem. I'm not a big consumer of fast fashion, so this is not really a topic that's really relevant for me. I don't care. Unfortunately, we are all part of the clothing problem. If we look around us today, you're probably wearing clothing right now. No one is in here not wearing clothing. And so whether that clothing is fashionable or not, unfortunately what that means is that we are all clothing consumers. And so we are all part of the problem of how clothing and fashion is contributing to climate change. A lot of people don't know, but just for us to have clothing on our backs today, there is a lot of environmental harm that goes into the process of making sure that we have clothes. And a lot of carbon emissions are generated. So a lot of people don't know about this. And how the fact that our clothing on our backs today contributes to climate change, how that happens is really in two ways. The first is in the manufacturing process itself. So how our clothing is actually made, the process is incredibly environmentally harmful. And the second part that the clothing on our backs contributes to climate change is through the copious amounts of textile waste that needs to be generated just for us to have clothes. And this is what I will talk about a little about today, is the problem of textile waste and how we can start actually thinking about solutions to this problem, because it helps us actually help fast fashion or the fashion industry impact the environment a bit less. So a lot of people don't know, but for us to have clothing, a lot of textile waste is generated, and it's generated in two parts. The first part is in the production process. So particularly in the cutting part and the cutting process of how a clothing is made. Just in that process alone, we are generating 60 million meters square of off-cut fabric. That's clean, fresh fabric, which tends to end on the cutting room floor of clothing manufacturers, and then it's swept up and dumped in landfill. And then we only get to the second part of the textile waste that most of you probably know about, which is secondhand clothing. I'm sure maybe you've heard about this problem. But then we get to that part, which is essentially where textile waste is created when you as the consumer are no longer interested in the garment, and that could be because it's now damaged or it's no longer in season, and so you now look to dispose of that garment, and so that generates textile waste. And between those two types of textile waste, as the world, we are generating 92 million tons of that textile waste just for us to have clothing on our backs, and all of that goes into landfill. And so if that's a very big figure that you don't understand, I can actually translate what that is. That is the equivalent of a truckload full of clothes being burnt or dumped in landfill every second. And there's only 1% of that textile waste that is recycled. So yes, the way in which our clothing is made is incredibly environmentally harmful. And the problem is actually even made worse by the fact that in countries where fast fashion is dominant, so particularly the West, the problem there is so big that it's now spilled over into Africa and on African landfills. And so now with fast fashion being so big there, I'm sure you've heard about secondhand clothing donation. So that is great, right? That gives us a thriving secondhand clothing market, and it really has. However, the flip side of that is most of what is donated to Africa is actually not even reusable. And so what happens to all of this non-reusable secondhand clothing that is donated to Africa? It ends up on African landfills. And so in countries such as Accra, they have 15 million items of secondhand clothing entering Accra every single week, of garments that are meant to be worn again. However, most of those garments are not even reusable. And so Accra, Nairobi, Tanzania, and even South Africa, we are now sitting with a textile waste problem that we did not create. And that is the unfortunate thing, that Africa is not even a big consumer of clothing. We're not even a big consumer of fast fashion. However, Africa is now sitting with a textile waste problem that it did not create. So that is pretty depressing, right? But luckily for you, I am here today to talk about the solutions. I mentioned earlier on that how clothing is contributing to climate change is in two key ways. The first being in the manufacturing process and how it is that our clothing is made. And secondly, I mentioned the amount of textile waste that is generated. And so part of the solutions and in us thinking about how the clothing industry can contribute less to climate change is us, one, improving the way in which our clothing is made, and two, eliminating textile waste. And this is how we think about it at the company that I work at Rewoven. And we at Rewoven divert textile waste from landfill by collecting it from source, so from the entity that is actually generating that textile waste, whether that be a clothing manufacturer who generates off-cut fabric or clothing rejects, or a clothing retailer who generates unsold inventory, or a hospital that generates scrubs. So any entity that generates textile waste, we collect it from them, and we ensure that that textile waste gets recycled and make a variety of recycled products from that, or it gets reused. One of the products that we make from this textile waste is 100% recycled fabric. And this textile waste is made by collecting the textile waste that we get from our different clients. We break it down into its fiber form. And so it becomes like a fluff. And once the textile waste is in this fluff form, it can then be respun to make new yarn and then rewoven to make a completely new fabric that can then be used to make new clothing again. And the fabric that we make from this textile waste looks completely the same as fabric that is not recycled, as you would not be able to tell with your naked eye that the fabric is recycled. So that is one of the ways that we have at Rewoven try and help the clothing industry contribute less to climate change, is we help it eliminate its textile waste and eliminate waste in general. The second way that we try to make sure that the clothing industry doesn't contribute to climate change is by making sure that we improve the process in which our clothing is made. And this is something that we pay attention to at Rewoven. The process that is required to create our 100% recycled fabric uses no water, it uses no dyes, it has no toxic chemicals, and it generates 50% less carbon emissions than the process that is required to make the fabric that we currently have today. And so this is very important for us helping to find climate smart solutions to the clothing industry. So circularity is important, as I've mentioned. Improving the process that our clothing is made from is important, and making sure that we use the waste to make new products. But for us at Rewoven, it's not just about circularity. It is about circularity that is embedded in social sustainability. And what does that mean? That is very important for me as someone from South Africa, someone from a country in the developing South, to not just have climate smart solutions that are ecologically sustainable, but for them to also be socially sustainable. And with a lot of the social and socioeconomic problems that we have in South Africa today, I think it's very important that whatever solutions that we try to come up with that are climate smart speaks to also trying to help with the social problems that we have. And one of those is unemployment. So I'm from South Africa, and the current unemployment rate, particularly for youth in South Africa, is currently at 70%, which is staggeringly high. And so one of the things that we like about recycling is that recycling is labor intensive, and it is therefore a very important way to not only help us divert waste from landfill, particularly in the clothing industry, but it can also help us create jobs, much needed jobs in a country like South Africa. The third thing that we do at Rewoven is, before even recycling, we actually also try to facilitate reuse. We have leftover fabrics that we then sell back to designers who then upcycle and make new garments from that. And we also encourage the reuse of the off-cut fabric that we collect. And I think this is an important point for me to emphasize on, this point of focusing on reuse before we even get to focusing on recycling. And I think this is important, especially as I'm speaking to all of us, right, who are clothing consumers. And I think as clothing consumers, one of the ways that we can help our clothing consumption contribute less to climate change is to make sure that our garments last longer. And one of the ways we can do this is through reusing them and also changing our mindset away from one of ownership and individuality, but more of one towards sharing, which can also facilitate the reuse of garments. And the reason for that mindset shift and the reason it is important is because sharing allows us to use resources a lot more efficiently, and it allows us to keep those resources in use for longer, and so we do not have to create new resources. And so we encourage reuse, but I think it's also important for all of us who are clothing consumers to really think about how we can keep our garments in use for longer, encourage reuse, and to be less dependent on constantly needing to get new garments, which will then need to be disposed of. So I've spoken a lot today about the problem of, one, how the clothing industry is contributing to climate change and how we are all part of that problem because we all wear clothing. But also then we spoke about the solutions to how we can make sure that the clothing industry is contributing less to climate change. One of the ways in which we've spoken about is through the work that we do at Rewoven, right? Which is, one, eliminating textile waste and making sure that we are creating products that last longer and that are continuously able to be recycled. And the second way is to make sure that we employ resource-efficient processes to make these garments. The second solution that I think we can all think about when it comes to making sure the clothing industry is contributing less to climate change is a mindset shift. A mindset shift away from an ownership model and an individualistic kind of a mindset towards a mindset that embraces sharing and what I would like to call as Ubuntu Consciousness. Because the ownership mentality and individualistic mindset encourages us to create more products which will then need to be disposed of, whereas a sharing mindset and Ubuntu Consciousness actually allows us to keep those resources in use and make sure that we use them efficiently by sharing them. And so there isn't a need to constantly create new products which will need to be disposed of. And the last 2 points that I think are important when it comes to thinking about how the clothing industry can be less environmentally harmful, I did not mention them today, but they are very important for us to still remember. The third being making sure that we still revive regenerative systems. And regenerative systems are ways in which clothing is made that are still aligned with natural systems. Making sure that we still embrace technology in all of our climate smart solutions. And the reason technology is important is because technology has a way of making things more efficient. Technology has a way of making sure that we can monitor and achieve climate smart goals, but it can also make sure that we are able to reach our impact through scalability. And so whatever climate smart solutions we do, we always need to think about, in this day and age, how technology can help us amplify those. And so as much as there's a big problem with clothing and we're all part of it, I think the solutions really lie in these last 4 points of how we can think about the clothing industry being less environmentally harmful. So one, making sure that we embrace circularity and resource efficient ways of producing. 2, making sure that we change our mindset towards Ubuntu Consciousness, towards a mindset that embraces sharing, as that is the only way to ensure that we use resources efficiently in the day and age that we live in. And the third, as I've mentioned, is embracing and reviving regenerative systems. And 4, obviously, to always remember to embrace technology in all of our efforts. Technology has a really important role to play in this day and age. And I think even in the clothing industry, whether that be clothing rental platforms and so many other examples, but we always need to remember that technology has a role to play in how it can help us be climate smart.